And I'm going to start with a few flashbacks. As soon as you get this going. Okay. In the wake of Hurricane Sandy, on October 29, 2012, as the evening high tide was drawn closer, cars could be seen floating on Wall Street. Apparently Reagan was right. The rising tide does lift all cars. Think of that, Wall Street, the place people had occupied with encampments, the target of rage in the aftermath of the financial crisis, were profiting from subprime mortgages, mortgages that left people homeless when they were left, quote unquote, underwater as housing prices dropped, was now literally underwater. Boom. Sandy took Wall Street to the woodshed. And then 2 years later, Wall Street was flooded again, this time by protesters. On September 21st, 2014, over 400,000 protesters marched in New York City and targeted Wall Street in particular for its role in unbridled capitalism, claiming it as the main culprit in the problem of climate change. Then flashback to New Jersey during Hurricane Sandy. As he waded knee-deep in the Atlantic City street, pummeled by Superstorm Sandy's winds, CNN's chief business correspondent, Ali Velshi, declared it was too early to tell whether Sandy would be a plus or a minus for the U.S. economy. Velshi's callous viewpoint is, of course, flowing naturally from the twisted logic of using the gross domestic product as the economy's most ubiquitous measure of economic well-being. GDP counts everything we spend money on as a plus, so it follows that the $60 billion and counting that we spent burying the dead and replacing lost homes and businesses after Sandy will make us better off. And so our economists are discounting one of the biggest crises of our time, perhaps the biggest existential crises of all, while flicking off the climate and Wall Street protesters like so many fleas on the dog's back and going full steam ahead with business as usual. But here's the thing, business as usual is insane in the current context. If we accept climate scientists such as NASA's former top climatologist James Hansen's prognosis, we pass the point of safe concentrations of carbon dioxide emissions in the Earth's atmosphere, and we are headed into uncharted territory. In a 2008 paper, Hansen claimed that 350 parts per million CO2 equivalent is the target we should be shooting for by the end of the century, if not sooner. Our current atmospheric concentration of CO2 is above 400 parts per million. The costs of climate change are now growing so large that in 2012, U.S. taxpayers outspent private insurers 3-to-1 to pay for the damages, more than taxpayers spent on education and transportation. Think about that. We're now spending more cleaning up the wreckage of our fossil fuel economy than we are educating our children. More than we're spending on high-speed trains or buses to take us places. Meanwhile, who's profiting from this mess? As this slide shows, in North America alone, oil, gas, and coal profits in 2012 were $271 billion, and the costs of climate change a rough estimate is $1.2 trillion a year, or 1.6% annually of global GDP. However, if we're to look at our GDP, this cost does not appear as anything but a positive. It doesn't matter if our taxes go up to pay for the damages. They're paying for goods and services, and that, according to the GDP, is a positive, even if it means means rebuilding your hurricane-ravaged house year after year. So I'm going to walk through just a very brief history of GDP, and for those of you who are economists, forgive me, I am not an economist, but Simon Kuznets was asked after the Great Depression to develop a system of national accounts, which he did. And as he was developing the system of national accounts, he warned that it should never be used to influence policy. He said the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income, and goals for growth should be more growth of what and for what. His warnings, however, were ignored, and not only did the U.S. put in place, at the time it was called gross national product, but then GDP later, but at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, as the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN were being formed in the 1940s, GDP was imposed as a metric of progress globally. Now, we've had warnings on GDP for quite some time. Robert F. Kennedy, here's a quote from his famous speech in 1968. The GDP does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, the joy of their play. It measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. And it tells us everything about America except why we are proud that we are Americans. You should listen to the original speech because, of course, RFK does that much better than I do with his wonderful Boston accent. We've got figures such as Joseph Stiglitz saying, what we measure affects what we do. If we have the wrong metrics, we will strive for the wrong things. In the quest to increase GDP, we may end up with a society in which most citizens have become worse off. So why is it that GDP fails us? I've mentioned a little bit about, sort of in rough form, the GDP is like a giant calorie counter that tabulates how many calories are in that plate of French fries, but it doesn't tell you whether or not you're worse off or better off as a result of eating the French fries or the apple. But let me break it down into a little bit more specific terms as to why it fails us as a measure of economic well-being. It measures activity good, bad, and neutral. We could be spending more for a lower quality of life, and yet GDP will increase. GDP gives no indication of sustainability, so consumption financed by debt, as in the housing crisis, or student loans, or depletion of human and social built or natural capital is assumed to be sustainable. All non-market aspects of the economy, such as unpaid labor that women do in the home, caring for the elderly, caring for children, caring for the sick, are not included. And of course, GDP says nothing about the distribution of wealth, income, or opportunity in society. Now, our president has recognized that income inequality is perhaps the defining challenge of our time. Here's an interesting graph that shows what's happening during every economic expansion since World War II, and what portion of it went to the wealthiest 10% and the poorest 90% of the households. As you can see in this graph, the income growth for every expansion has delivered more of its benefits to the top and less to the bottom 90%. The drop in the bottom 90% share really started to plummet in the 1982 to 1990 period, thanks to Reaganomics. Moreover, the real inflation-adjusted incomes of the bottom 90%, for the first time in the recovery, these figures are now in. And as you can see, the distribution of income for the bottom 90% has actually dropped below zero, and the top 10% is doing quite well. So think of the Walmart workers, those workers who have jobs at Walmart, but who cost taxpayers $6.2 billion for food stamps and other public assistance. What does that mean? It means we're not investing in our future, and in fact, we're using tax money to subsidize big corporate treats. Of course, not everyone is suffering. The New York Times writes about how some super wealthy families are buying or renting second homes close to boarding schools so that they can keep a close eye on their kids as they go to schools like Exeter and Hotchkiss. This takes helicopter parenting to a whole new level. As I'm witnessing as the mother of a 14-year-old, the educational divide is widening very fast, at least as fast as the income divide. The only other year since 1913 that the wealthy had claimed such a large share of national income was in 1928, when the top 1%'s share was 23.9%. The following year, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. After peaking again in 2007, the U.S. stock market crashed in 2008, leading to what some are now calling the Great Recession. Some think that it could crash again. Now, economist Hazel Henderson states, statistical indicators can become the structural DNA codes of nations. They reflect a society's values and goals and become the key drivers of economic and technological choices. But if our values and our goals are not reflected in our leading statistical indicator, then what does that say about our nation? It says our economy, and in fact our entire global economy, is proceeding without the values and goals that we claim to hold dear, and it may just be headed for a crash unless we change course. GDP is silent on the devastation of climate change. It's silent on the growing income inequality gap. It's silent on the time wasted needlessly stuck in traffic. It's silent on the things that are costing us money every day, costing us healthcare costs and lost work hours. It's silent on the time of a mother that she spends with her child after birth. It's silent on the value of early childhood education. One key action step to tackle both the issue of climate change and income inequality is beginning to get our metrics right and moving beyond GDP. So I'm going to walk through what I see as some of the solutions to addressing these problems. And I want to, before I go into this, a lot of folks think, this is pie in the sky. Maryland and Vermont have both put in place the Genuine Progress Indicator, which is, Maryland was the first jurisdiction in the world to do so. It's the first state to measure economic activity in the sense of overall well-being of a society. Oregon and Washington are about to put this indicator into place, and I'll be getting back to the Maryland situation at the end of the talk. But so one of the things that we say in the situation in Maryland is that we need to measure what we treasure, and then we get what we measure. So step one is moving beyond GDP. I was hosting Naomi Klein at Powell's Books the other day in Portland, Oregon, and she's just come out with a fantastic new book called This Changes Everything, which I helped her write, I helped her research for her book and her husband, Avi Lewis's film. And I strongly encourage you to read that book because she has basically tied these two issues together beautifully. How to address the income inequality divide while also addressing the climate crisis. And one of the things that she talks about is the need to reclaim our commons, including our public schools, our public utilities, our public spaces, and our public land, and even expand them to help us steer the ship of state through the storms that lie ahead, literally and figuratively. We need to be playing a much more, we need to be more engaged with utilities. We need to be engaged with the Public Utilities Commission in each state demanding renewable energy now. We need to be prioritizing jobs that can help save money for our existing commons, like public schools and public transit and public utilities and public lands, while also addressing the climate crisis. So you actually would get a 2-for-1. You get good, steady jobs while also addressing the climate crisis. If we imposed a tax on the financial transactions, some people call it a Robin Hood tax, it would achieve two things. It would both slow down the sloshing of money globally and slow down this global economy that's now on steroids. And we could use that tax to help pay for the climate transition. We need to tax pollution and pay people. One idea that is now out there is this notion of a fee and dividend. It's like a carbon tax, only there would be a monthly dividend for everybody in the U.S. economy, assuming that they use public transportation or rode a bike, they would actually come out ahead. If they continue to drive their wasteful SUVs, they would come out behind. Another idea, I was in Germany a couple of years ago, and very successful program in Germany is this feed-in tariff, which has allowed German citizens to basically become mini utilities. Every single home is generating power, feeding it into the grid, and getting paid to do so from renewable energy systems. Feed-in tariffs have been enormously successful in countries and jurisdictions around the world where they've been tried, and it's another way of beginning to help benefit the people economically while also putting in place clean energy systems. Another exciting development in the state of Oregon is an initiative that's on the ballot to essentially put a stop to all new fossil fuel infrastructure. It has a good chance of passing next year, and this is part of a global effort to reject all new carbon infrastructure in all of its forms. Now, this encompasses the divestment effort, which I was speaking with someone about beforehand, divesting universities from fossil fuels, divesting, if you're part of a church or any, if you're an individual, divesting your retirement funds of fossil fuels. But it also includes taking on the fracking issue, pipelines such as the Keystone XL pipeline, oil, gas, and coal exports, mountaintop removal, Arctic and deep sea drilling, and the financing of fossil fuel infrastructure using public institutions such as the World Bank and other development banks. And on that note, I just wanted to say, one of the things I was doing these last 17 years in Washington, D.C., I started at the Institute for Policy Studies with a project where I wanted to essentially follow the money. This is something I learned at the Center for Investigative Reporting. It was an important thing to do. Follow the money, find out where it goes. So I was curious about all of this money that was flowing from the World Bank to India, which is a country that I had grown up in. I was born and raised in India. My father was a medical doctor teaching there. And I wondered why it was that India was getting so much of this investment in energy infrastructure. So I went to India, to the region where most of the money was flowing to see for myself what this money was resulting in. Most of it was going into coal mines and coal-fired power plants. And when I went to a village called Tulcha, which is in Orissa, where a good portion of World Bank money was flowing, what I saw there blew my mind. I couldn't believe. The first thing you notice in the town of Tulcha is, of course, the smell of coal. It's just, people in part because the forest is gone. You get to the river downstream from the coal-fired power plant, and the river itself is black because they aren't even bothering to dispose of the fly ash in any sort of appropriate way, such as, what is appropriate, I don't know, but they certainly don't have it in lined pits as we're supposed to here in the United States. They just dump it directly into the river. And I saw this child, and he was gray. His skin was gray, his clothes were gray, and I watched him go up to this river, and he was trying to get a drink of water. The water table had been completely depleted by the cooling towers for the coal-fired power plant. The only way he could get a drink of water was to come to this riverbank and try to sift through the sandy black soil next to the river and scoop up water. He wasn't alone. The entire riverbank, there was a woman who was trying to wash her clothes the same way, scooping up the soil next to the river and trying to wash her clothes. I froze at that moment, and I realized I'd seen poverty, I'd seen hunger, I'd seen a lot of things in India, but I'd never seen anything this devastating. And I came back to Washington, D.C., and I told the guy who was actually in charge of this particular loan to the World Bank, do you realize what they're doing? Do you realize they're dumping fly ash directly into the river? And he said, oh, is there a river near that? The man had never been to the site. And we protested. We did everything. We went to the board. The board did not give us a hearing. They went full steam ahead with more and more coal-fired power plants financed across India, coal mines. And so we did a report, my colleague Jim Liggett and I, and what we did is we looked at the entire portfolio of the World Bank in their energy sector. And what we found from 1992 to 1997, what we found was that the World Bank had over 5 years' time, beginning in 1992, when they were invited by the UN to actually accelerate the expansion of renewable energy in the developing world. They had done the exact opposite. They had invested billions of dollars in oil, gas, and coal infrastructure around the world. The beneficiaries of all of this finance were G7-based corporations like Enron, Exxon, Halliburton. Halliburton was right up there. And less than 5%, and probably closer to 1% of all of this energy investment actually went to meet the energy needs of the poorest. The 2 billion people that they were talking about that they desperately needed to provide energy for. Most of it was going, as I saw in my trip around Orissa, to aluminum smelters. Smelting aluminum with coal. Can you imagine a more, and dirty coal, lignite coal, high ash coal, some of the worst. And of course the aluminum smelters were owned by the likes of Alcoa and Al Suisse and Alcan. They were not Indian aluminum smelters. So we took on the World Bank. We took on the World Bank with a report that we released right before the G7 meeting, translated it into 4 languages, released it simultaneously in 7 countries. And the World Bank had to respond. We said, you're causing climate change. You're not a solution to the climate crisis. And it took some time, but about 5 years later, we managed to get the World Bank to actually agree to do an extractive industries review. And that review, even though it was headed up by a man who was part of a former coal company under Schumacher, that review found that the poor were in fact worse off as a result of these investments in fossil fuels, and that it recommended that the World Bank get out of coal immediately, get out of oil by 2008, and rapidly ramp up its investments in renewables. We were stunned. And then the bank's board of directors voted to reject the report's recommendations. So we didn't give up, and the campaign continued, and just last year, President Obama called on the World Bank to get out of coal. And a few weeks later, the president of the World Bank said, the climate crisis is serious, we're going to get out of coal. Of course, there's a lot of wiggle room, but they are in the process of getting out of coal. Shortly thereafter, the European Investment Bank announced they were going to get out of coal. Exim Bank announced they were going to get out of coal. The Nordic countries said they would no longer use their taxpayer money to fund coal. So what started as a very discouraging situation, and in many ways a very depressing situation, and we're beginning, it's taken 17 years, but we're beginning to see shifts. And I would suggest that now, with the divestment campaigns that are underway globally, with universities taking on not just the coal industry, but the entire fossil fuel industry and divesting, as Stanford has done and other universities have done, this process of divestment is a reality right now, and it's very exciting how quickly things are moving. One of the critical aspects of the divestment movement, of course, is that we need to also invest, not just divest, invest in clean, renewable energy. It is possible to get to 100% renewable energy in this country by 2035. Dr. Arjun Makhijani with the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research has a report up on his website. You can download it there, called Carbon-Free, Nuclear-Free. You can do it without nuclear power. It's possible. We need to push it at least by 2035, if not sooner. We need a moral and social rejection of carbon profiteers, and I would include in that carbon traders, which encompasses the divestment effort, and a rejection of political contributions from the fossil fuel industry for all of our political candidates, the end to financing and the public shunning of deniers and fossil apologists, especially at the university level, especially. Getting people like David Koch off the boards of universities, hospitals, museums, and other public institutions is going to be key. We need to reject all fossil fuel advertising, treating it the same way we did tobacco. And we need a clear acceptance of the need for justice for the victims and survivors of this ongoing evil. Climate disaster survivors, people in or downstream of coal fields, fracking zones, tar sand strip mines, those next to refineries and compressor stations, the casualties of wars bred by climate collapse and the global infrastructure of extraction. We need to make sure that we have a way of compensating them for these damages. And one of the key things I think that is going to help us get there is to get labor unions on board a Green New Deal for the U.S. and a Marshall Plan for the world. That may sound ambitious, but it's actually, I would argue, that it's beginning. We need to challenge the illogic of the free market, the illogic of austerity, and infuse money into public infrastructure to build a truly good public transit that we all need, and renewable energy. Now, some say, well, that's a pipe dream. You can't get labor unions on board any sort of climate change agenda. Their interests are inherently at cross purposes. Well, actually, in the U.S., investment in renewable energy creates more jobs than investment in capital-intensive fossil fuel. In fact, a University of California study showed that 5.65 jobs are created for every $1 million invested in solar energy, and 70 cents in wind, and only, no, I've got to put my glasses on. Sorry. So I'll start over. A University of California study showed that 5.65 jobs are created for every $1 million invested in solar energy, 5.7 million in wind, and only 3.96 in coal. And a study of the 2009 stimulus package noted that investments in public transportation had created 31% more jobs, dollar for dollar, than those in new road construction. Even the regulations long denounced by industry as job destroying can turn out to be the opposite. The Environmental Protection Agency projected that new emission standards that it proposed for coal-fired power plants would create up to 31,000 construction jobs and 9,000 permanent utility jobs. The Blue-Green Alliance calculated that the new corporate average fuel efficiency standards that would cut carbon emissions nearly in half for cars and light-duty trucks, when the standards had been fully implemented, that they would create nearly 50,000 jobs. Now the word is that in Chicago, nearby Chicago, there are electric dump trucks that are making their way on the city streets. That means less money spent hauling waste and more money, potentially, for city workers. There are also electric school buses that are starting to come online, and according to Motive, the company that makes the trucks, between cheap fuel and low maintenance, a single electric bus can save $11,000 per year over its diesel counterpart. Now, one of the things that I think is most promising is for solar to be applied at the university and the school level, both because it's an excellent opportunity for education, but it's also an opportunity to save money. The public school system in Plymouth, Massachusetts claims the country's second largest school-based array at 5.57 megawatts of capacity, and power from that array results in 60% of the 8,000 student school system's energy needs being met and a $500,000 savings in their energy bill. An analysis conducted by the Solar Foundation found that 450 school districts nationwide could each save more than $1 million over 30 years by installing a solar system, and some districts could see energy savings reaching into the tens of millions of dollars. Okay, so back to how do we bring organized labor on board a climate agenda? Well, we currently have support, surprising support for the climate agenda in a variety of labor unions. Nurses, for example, support that Robin Hood tax that I mentioned earlier. They have been rallying around that as a way of addressing the climate crisis while also taxing the 1%. Taxi drivers in the city of New York support hybrid and electric vehicles. Of course, they see it as very much in their interest to move towards hybrid and electric vehicles. As I mentioned earlier, auto workers are supporting fuel efficiency standards. Transit workers obviously are lobbying for more transit funding, public transit funding. Utility workers are calling for serious commitment to climate change legislation. Now, my colleague, Dr. John Talbert, who actually helped develop the Genuine Progress Indicator that's in place in Maryland and in Vermont and soon in Oregon and Washington, recently took this analysis down to the city level and looked at the city of Baltimore's climate action plan. So he used the 26 indicators that comprise the Genuine Progress Indicator to evaluate how much it would cost the city of Baltimore or benefit the city of Baltimore to take action on climate change. And he found that if fully implemented today, the economic benefits would range between $565 to $720 million per year. It would boost the Genuine Progress Indicator, which measures overall well-being for the city by 4 to 5% each year. or between $909 and $1,158 per person. And as you see here, there are quite a few benefits that he calculated, everything from energy savings to reduced costs of commuting, benefits of new jobs, an increase in the urban tree canopy, and in a sense, of course, there are costs associated with implementing the Climate Action Plan, which range between 64 million and 114 million. But overall, the social return on this investment has a benefit cost ratio between 6 and 8. And this gives you a sense of where most of the benefits are coming from, largely from climate and air quality benefits, but also from infrastructure benefits, investments in household spending. People are able to spend more as a result of money savings, reduced traffic. Now, the call to move beyond GDP is not just a call that's being taken up at the state level. It's a call that's actually being taken up at the international level. In fact, at the UN's Earth Summit Plus 20, the Beyond GDP initiative was actually initially on the agenda, but it got removed at the last minute. Here's OECD Secretary General Angel Gurria, who says, "We are facing both an opportunity and a duty to rethink what progress really means and to build stronger and more inclusive visions for the future of our societies. We have to move towards measuring welfare, not just output. It will constitute a major contribution to stability and democracy." So Governor Martin O'Malley, who is the first, as I mentioned, Maryland is the first state that's put in place the genuine progress indicator. He says a system without feedback eventually fails, and our country, our states, our cities, they're all systems. Life creates the conditions that are conducive to life. Perhaps there is no better description of the intent of the genuine progress indicator. Its purpose is to further the conditions that are conducive to life. Now, I just looked up the clock and I realized, oh my gosh, it's already almost 1:50, and the rest of my talk is largely focused on the genuine progress indicator in Maryland, and I think what I'm going to do is, rather than continue with these slides, I think what I'll do is I will open it up to questions and conversation, because I'd like to have time to talk with all of you. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry I went on so long. I didn't realize it had gone quite this long, but it's great to be here.
Thank you. Questions? Anyone? Go over here.
Hi, thank you for that. I just had a question. So I can see how the plan can help with the redistribution of wealth and income, and also shift some forms of pollution production. But I was wondering if it doesn't really speak to a halting of consumption. Even like trying to redistribute wealth, you might see increased consumption. Do you think that it's necessary to halt consumption in any way, or if shifting and potentially slowing that consumption would be possible for us to reach a sustainable society?
Yeah, I mean, you've sort of zeroed in on one of the criticisms of the genuine progress indicator, which is that it does actually include personal consumption expenditures, but it does it as, saying that there is a certain value to that money sort of recirculating within the economy, whether that money is spent on items that are sustainably produced, or whether it's spent on goods and services where there is theoretically a much less lower environmental impact. capture all of these other, what are currently externalized costs of consumption, the cost of climate change, the cost of depletion of forest cover, the cost of air pollution, the cost of forest depletion, the cost of crime. So it's by no means a silver bullet, and I don't want to pretend that it is. I think what it does is it helps us approximate overall well-being for a society, and therefore moves us beyond something that's clearly imperfect in gross domestic product and gross state product to something that more closely approximates overall well-being for environmental, social, and economic well-being for all. I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
So a few states have implemented this. Could you talk a little bit about how, like, either a state or a city or a university would go about looking into this, like, for locally?
Well, it's actually a perfect opportunity for universities to take on, because what's needed now, we need economists that are trained in doing these accounts. John Talbot, who I mentioned earlier, who helped develop the Genuine Progress Indicator, is one of only a handful of economists that is trained in developing these accounts, and we need dozens and dozens all over the country if we're going to be moving in this direction. What can be done and what is being done in Portland, for example, we're working with Portland State University to develop the system of accounts for the state of Oregon. Oregon will eventually put the GPI into place, but it's an excellent opportunity for graduate students and professors to engage in something that has very real-life consequences in terms of, well, in the state of Oregon for it moving forward, but the advantage of doing it at the university level, regardless of what's happening at the state level, is that it can then go from the university to the governmental level. It's hard to have the government introduce a concept that they don't fully understand, and that was one of the catch-22s that was in place in Maryland, which is one reason why it took a while for the accounts, once Governor O'Malley had committed to it, it took a while for the accounts to actually get up and running, so there was nobody who was trained to do this. So it would be great to have that exercise engaged in right away in Illinois if the state is thinking of moving in that direction.
You mentioned the Koch brothers, and they're a good symbol for the vested interests. And David Koch was giving money to NOVA. I noticed definitely they were low, not hitting the climate crisis as well as they should have, and he was on the NET PBS. These vested interests are just overwhelming, it seems to me. And I don't know whether they're shipping this coal, or we have, the statements of the World Bank changing, Obama saying, but at the same time, he's touting this energy revolution, and now we're shipping so much oil and natural gas, we're looking at LNGs, and I think you on Facebook were saying that a ton of coal is 33 cents a ton from national lands. I wanted you to, it's not a very focused question, but.
No, I agree with you. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think Obama is taking one step forward, two steps back with, on the one hand saying we need to tackle the climate crisis, regulate coal-fired power plants, move towards energy efficient vehicles, et cetera. And then at the same time, he's pushing all of the above strategy, the worst of which I think is our export of coal at rock bottom prices. As you mentioned, 35 cents a ton from public lands going on coal trains headed off to India and China and other parts of Asia. It just doesn't make any sense, and that's one reason why people are beginning to protest these coal trains. Just as they're protesting the Keystone XL pipeline, it turns out the Pacific Northwest, if it moves ahead with this fossil fuel infrastructure, the carbon content of the exports that are planned is 5 times the Keystone XL pipeline. So So all of us have been very concerned about the tar sands, but the coal exports, the oil, the LNG exports that are planned through the rivers and the rail in the Pacific Northwest are far greater.
2 points. But first, it's a very good analysis. 2 points. One of your earlier slides, you had the insurance companies as one of the beneficiaries in terms of the disasters that have happened. Well, I don't know if you've owned your own home, but those of us that do get our insurance bills. And I noticed that it has been going up the last few years. And the explanation that was given was that the insurance pools that the insurance companies had to go into to cover the damage from Katrina and Sandy and these other things that have been happening have been diminished, and the insurance companies have to replenish that, of course, to get the policyholders. And so that's how that thing secondly, I've been seeing some things about revisiting nuclear energy going about. Is there people that are actually taking another look at nuclear energy, or is this just the same old efficient industry having the same argument with repackaging, a little prettier package?
Well, I confess a bias on the second question because I'm on the board of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, which is an anti-nuclear group, and I've actually had arguments about this with my father, who was very pro-nuclear. I do not think nuclear power is the answer to our crisis. All you have to do is do a cost-benefit analysis, and it's clear. Never mind the enormous costs of storing the waste for thousands upon thousands of years. All you have to do is look at Fukushima to see what kind of costs that country is paying. Germany has proven that it's possible to move beyond nuclear. They have not yet moved beyond coal. The U.S. has the most nuclear reactors of any country in the world, but most of those, we've actually started to shut down a lot of these reactors. And people say, well, wind and solar is intermittent. How could we possibly get to 100% renewables? Geothermal is actually, I just was speaking with someone who participated in a geothermal conference in Portland from the State Department. The State Department is very interested in geothermal, both for the United States and globally, because it isn't intermittent. It's a constant source of energy, and it's ramping up now with the move for action on climate change. But even with just wind and solar, there's an awful lot of new emerging developments on that front, and I would just say nuclear is a thing of the past. We really need to move past nuclear.
You emphasize coal, but you haven't talked about natural gas.
Right.
And what it involves, and transportation, and how that's, nor have you spoken about oil extraction.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it seems to me those two
Those
things
two are
are equally.
Absolutely. As is, both our carbon accounts in terms of fossil fuels, but also how we avoid climate change, which is hopefully not continuing to accelerate deforestation the way we have and continue to do in the Pacific Northwest. Gas has been called a bridge fuel, although some people call it a gangplank fuel. It is certainly, upon combustion, it's less carbon intensive than coal, but it's in the process of the fracking and the transportation that methane leakage can actually make it worse than coal. This is not me saying this. This is a study by Professor Howard of Cornell University. There are other studies that have confirmed that the estimations around the carbon impact of natural gas are vastly underestimate its climate benefits. Of course, then there's also the cost of earthquakes, the cost of water contamination. As much as we are on a fracking boom, and in fact you could call Obama the fracker-in-chief, he's been pushing it so vigorously. The concern is that it's underpricing. It's essentially squeezing out the market for clean energy, real clean energy that will last us forever and ever. Fracking can only last us a certain amount of time, and we are on a climate deadline that we have to deal with. We have to get down below, keep our emissions below 2 degrees centigrade. We're headed towards 4 to 6 degrees centigrade, and gas is not a way of addressing the climate crisis. Oil, again, there's, it's sort of considered where we're extracting oil. It's like, who was it? I'm forgetting the name of the professor who said it's a form of extreme energy, where we're going to great lengths and depths to extract oil, again with fracking as well, but in our outer continental shelf. And in terms of moving beyond oil, there are, look at what's happening with Tesla, developing a car that's going to be all electric, affordable, $35,000 if you call that affordable. Certainly more affordable than the earlier Teslas. The future is moving beyond fossil fuels, and the sooner the U.S. can get ahead of the curve and begin developing that future, the sooner we'll all benefit.
So you mentioned a little bit about dirt cheap costs of energy right now, and you spoke a little bit about the independent systems of charging the cost on carbon. Are there any comparisons of how GDP is affected? So putting the cost on carbon, how that affects GDP and how that affects GPI, or would they come out differently? I'm curious.
There was actually a study that was just done very recently, and I may be confusing it with, there have been several that were covered by the New York Times recently. I believe there was a series of studies by a group of economists that found that acting on climate change would be virtually free, if not benefit by putting a price on carbon. The place that I would go to for the most thorough analysis would be the Carbon Tax Center. They have a good website, and I would take a look at their analysis in terms of the impacts on GDP.
I actually have two questions. So first, I was intrigued by attending a recent meeting on geothermal, and the question I'm asking myself is that with an emphasis on local utilization of geothermal, some support for that, or utilizing geothermal for large-scale generation of energy that can be transported?
Well, my understanding, I wish I had attended the conference so I could have been a little more knowledgeable on this, but my understanding of what they were talking about was large-scale energy production in the United States, and according to this friend of mine who works at the State Department in their international division, geothermal will provide 100% of U.S. energy. I mean, there is that much geothermal energy within the United States, so we could get 100% of our energy from geothermal. Would we want to? I don't know, it depends on how we want to develop the grid for that and where it is. And so to me, it's a question of a combination of things, but it definitely could be a source of energy for the entire country.
And that's hot rock geothermal.
Hot rock geothermal, yeah. And then, of course, there is the other alternative, which is geothermal sort of heating as a way of keeping your house both hot and cool by using the temperature of the earth with geothermal. I forget the name of the actual process, but that's relatively expensive. I know that there are houses that are built with that in mind, but I'm not aware of it being done very affordably. I may be wrong.
Actually, say something about that because Professor Stout Holmberg is having an open house tomorrow from 10 to 2, and he's got his brand new Nissan S that you can see, and he's got his geothermal heating and cooling and his solar now. The active geothermal with hot rocks and all that is one thing, but there are a lot of people that are modifying their own home heating and cooling system. It's just basically a heat pump that uses the constant temperature of the earth. Once you go down a certain amount, you're circulating fluid in it and doing a heat pump exchange. And he calculates, Scott calculates his benefit in terms of his return on his investment. He takes the amount that he is putting forward in it and calculates that it's around a 6 to 8% payoff per year in terms of how much it lowers his utility bills.
Well, I stand corrected. Thank you very much for that.
And it's being done on college campuses too. Ball State University has done their whole physical plant, and so has Lakeland College in the two.
Do you know what the upfront investment is?
Well, in Lakeland in the two, they had a huge energy bill because their buildings were inefficient and they needed to redo everything anyway. And so they looked around for the most effective way of lowering this huge bill and found out about the system, and it turns out the geothermal alone is paid for the things that they want to do with wind and solar. They're progressing along now.
Yeah.
It's generally 6 to 8 times more expensive than standard air conditioning.
It's 6 to 8 times more expensive than what?
Than standard heating and air conditioning.
Standard heating, yeah. So it's the upfront investment. I think that's one of the things that people are wrestling with and beginning to find a solution to for example, in California with the upfront investment for renewables. There are new companies that are coming online basically saying, we'll install solar for free on your house. Of course, that means you're solar, but, so there are pluses and minuses to that. But that's one way of addressing the economics. Surely there must be some way of amortizing it, putting it into a home mortgage so that people don't have to pay the upfront costs, and that's something that could be perhaps dealt with legislatively, just as it could be with the renewable energy issue. People could just fold these costs into their mortgage. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to do so.
In Scott's case, he had money that he wanted to invest and was looking around at how low interest rates are, and 8% was very favorable for as an investment. So that's
absolutely
one of the
an
things.
awesome investment, 8% return.
But I think it's like a 15-year payback that it takes to recover.
Well, that's one thing that I think. You're pointing out one of many ways in which we need to change the system, and it really is up to us. This is the leadership. I'm amazed in dealing with people at the state level, how little, until we literally provide the studies for them, including the genuine progress indicator, unless we are actually taking an active role with our government, a lot of these things will not happen. So if you want to save money